He smiled when we showed him the evidence. That was the moment we realized we were interrogating the wrong species. The recording began with nothing but silence, followed by the uneasy voice of a senior coalition investigator whose name had been permanently removed from every public archive. Across hundreds of civilized worlds, the story would later become required reading for intelligence officers, diplomats, and military commanders alike. Not because a war had been won, not because a secret weapon had been revealed, but because an entire civilization discovered there was something far more dangerous than superior technology. There was a human who understood how minds worked. Deep inside Coalition Security Complex 9, the atmosphere felt heavier than recycled air should have. Every hallway carried the quiet tension of people pretending they still had everything under control. Behind a reinforced observation window sat prisoner KX-17, an intelligence operative from the Orthian Dominion. According to Coalition records, he had orchestrated infiltrations across 14 star systems without leaving behind a single usable lead. He had survived telepathic scans, adaptive truth analyzers, emotional resonance mapping, and every cognitive assessment ever developed by the Coalition's greatest scientific institutions. For 23 straight days, the best interrogators in known space had walked into that room confident they would be the one to crack him. 23 days later, every one of them walked back out carrying the same report. Subject remains psychologically impenetrable. Commander Olivia Grant stared through the glass with tired eyes, a paper cup of cold coffee forgotten in her hand. "Tell me again," she said quietly, "how a civilization that claims deception is biologically impossible produced someone like him." Dr. Lena Brooks adjusted the display floating above the conference table. "We believe he memorized every possible question before his capture." No, Grant shook her head. "That explains preparation. It does not explain confidence." No one answered. The room had become familiar with silence over the past 3 weeks. Every expert had a theory. None of them had results. Finally, someone near the back cleared his throat. "There is another option." Several heads turned. The young analyst looked almost embarrassed. "Earth offered assistance yesterday." Grant sighed. "The behavioral consultant?" "Yes, ma'am." Someone else laughed under his breath. "You're telling me after 3 weeks of quantum psychology, neural modeling, and empathic synchronization, we're calling in a human with interview experience?" Nobody laughed with him. Earth had quietly built a reputation for solving problems nobody else understood. That reputation made everyone uncomfortable. 20 minutes later, the security doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum. The man who stepped inside looked nothing like the legends people imagined. Daniel Mercer wore a Navy sport coat over a light blue button-down with the sleeves casually rolled to his forearms. He carried a worn leather notebook instead of a military case. His graying hair looked like he had driven with the windows down, and reading glasses rested on the collar of his shirt. He glanced around the room, smiled politely, and nodded. "Morning," he said. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic coming over from the embassy was awful." The Coalition officers exchanged confused looks. This was the specialist Earth had recommended? Daniel accepted the briefing packet but barely looked at it. "How long have you been questioning him?" 23 days, Grant replied. "And what have you learned?" "Nothing." Daniel nodded once, closed the folder without reading another page, and looked through the observation glass. The prisoner sat perfectly still, almost relaxed. Daniel smiled again, though this time it carried something impossible to read. "Actually," he said, "I think you've already taught him exactly how to beat you." Grant frowned. "Can you get him to talk?" Daniel slipped his notebook into his jacket pocket and walked toward the interrogation room door. Just before the security lock disengaged, he turned back with the same calm expression. "I don't need him to talk," he said. "I just need him to believe I already know the truth." Daniel Mercer stepped into the interrogation room without carrying a tablet, a scanner, or even a chair. He looked around as if he had walked into an ordinary office instead of the Coalition's most secure holding facility. The alien operative watched him with the same calm expression that had frustrated dozens of investigators before him. For Silver Eyes tracked every movement with mechanical precision. Daniel noticed immediately, not because the prisoner was intimidating, but because he was too controlled. Nobody stayed perfectly relaxed for 23 days unless they believed they had already won. Daniel slowly pulled out the chair across the table, turned it around, and sat with his arms resting comfortably across the back. Neither man spoke. The silence stretched for almost a full minute. Behind the observation glass, Commander Olivia Grant folded her arms. Is he waiting for permission to begin? One analyst whispered. Dr. Lena Brooks shook her head. No, he already has. Inside the room, Daniel studied the prisoner the way an old mechanic studied an engine that refused to start. He was not searching for guilt. He was searching for habit. Every person had one. Some people filled silence. Others avoided eye contact. Some became defensive. Some became helpful. Human behavior had patterns because humans grew up surrounded by uncertainty. Daniel had spent almost 30 years learning those patterns. What fascinated him now was that this man had almost none. Finally, the prisoner spoke. You are different from the others. His English sounded almost flawless, softened by the coalition translator. Daniel shrugged. Everybody keeps telling me that. You are not carrying any equipment. No reason to. You do not intend to question me? Daniel smiled faintly. Not today. That answer produced the smallest pause. Barely half a second. Most people in the observation room would never have noticed it. Daniel did. The prisoner had prepared himself for questions. He had not prepared himself for their absence. Then why are you here? The alien asked. Daniel leaned back. Honestly, I wanted to see if the reports were accurate. And are they? Mostly. The prisoner remained still, but Daniel noticed another tiny hesitation before the next response. It was almost invisible. Interesting, Daniel thought. He wants certainty. Grant pressed a hand against the communication console outside. He has not asked a single useful question, she muttered. Give him another minute, Brooks replied quietly. Daniel looked around the room instead of at the prisoner. You know, he said casually, this place reminds me of an interview room I worked in outside Chicago years ago. Terrible coffee. Uncomfortable chairs. Somebody always forgot to fix the air conditioning. The prisoner blinked once. Why are you telling me this? Because conversation is less exhausting than interrogation. You expect me to trust you? Daniel chuckled softly. No. Trust is expensive. I am just trying to pass the time. Another pause. Slightly longer now. Daniel could almost hear the gears turning behind those silver eyes. Every previous investigator had followed procedure. Introduce yourself. State the charges. Apply pressure. Build toward confession. Daniel had ignored every rule. The alien could not identify the pattern because there was no familiar pattern to identify. That uncertainty was doing exactly what weeks of advanced technology had failed to accomplish. It was forcing him to think about Daniel instead of protecting his own secrets. Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall, stood up, and walked toward the door. That is all, the prisoner asked, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. Daniel rested one hand on the handle without turning around. For today, you learned nothing. Daniel smiled without looking back. That is not entirely true. He opened the door. You just asked your first unplanned question. That tells me we are finally making progress. Commander Olivia Grant waited until the interrogation room door sealed shut before turning toward Daniel. You were inside for less than 6 minutes, she said. He did not confess to anything. Daniel reached for the pot of stale coffee sitting on the conference table and poured himself a cup without asking. He took one sip, made a face, and set it back down. That is terrible. One of the analysts blinked. You are worried about the coffee? No, Daniel replied. I am worried that everyone in this room is looking for answers instead of patterns. He walked toward the wall display showing every interview conducted during the past 23 days. Hundreds of hours of recordings filled the screen. Play the first interview. The footage appeared. A coalition investigator entered, introduced himself, explained the prisoner's legal status, and began asking carefully prepared questions. Daniel stopped the recording after 30 seconds. Next, another investigator. Different species. Different voice. Same structure. Next, another recording. Same routine again. Grant slowly frowned. They all followed protocol. Exactly, Daniel said. You trained him. The room fell quiet. Daniel picked up a marker and wrote 3 words across the digital board. Predict. Prepare. Perform. Every person who walked through that door taught him something. He learned your rhythm, your expectations, your habits. By the end of the first week, he was no longer answering questions. He was performing for an audience. Dr. Lena Brooks crossed her arms. Our procedures are based on centuries of behavioral science. Daniel nodded. Human behavioral science. She looked confused. Is there another kind? Daniel smiled. Apparently. He tapped the image of the prisoner on the screen. Tell me something about his species. Brooks opened a file. The Orthians evolved as highly cooperative social organisms. Their communication developed around complete informational reliability. Their language contains almost no structural ambiguity, meaning, historically, deliberate deception never provided an evolutionary advantage. Daniel looked around the room. There it is. Nobody spoke. He continued. Humans grew up in a completely different environment. Every child learns very early that people hide birthday presents, exaggerate stories, bluff during games, avoid awkward conversations, and sometimes tell lies for selfish reasons or kind reasons. We spend our entire lives sorting through mixed signals. Grant looked toward the observation window. You think that changes how we think? Daniel laughed quietly. Commander, human children learn sarcasm before they understand taxes. We spend decades practicing uncertainty. An older coalition psychologist leaned forward. The Orthians detect inconsistencies extremely well. Because they expect consistency, Daniel answered. That is the difference. He drew another line beneath the first 3 words and added 2 more. Expect. Disrupt. They are brilliant at solving puzzles that have solutions. They are not equipped for puzzles where someone keeps changing the rules. Grant stared at the board. That is why you never asked him a real question. Questions give him structure. Structure gives him confidence. Daniel folded his hands. I gave him nothing to prepare for. Brooks replayed the recording from moments earlier. They watched every second again. This time they noticed things they had completely missed before. The prisoner had remained perfectly composed until Daniel mentioned leaving. Then came the unexpected question. That is all. Daniel pointed at the screen and paused the image. There. One analyst frowned. He sounded curious. No. Daniel replied softly. He sounded uncertain. For the first time since arriving here, he could not predict the next move. Grant looked back at Daniel. So what happens tomorrow? Daniel glanced through the glass. The prisoner was sitting exactly where he had been before, but something had changed. His eyes no longer rested on the empty room. They stayed fixed on the closed door, waiting. Daniel slipped his notebook into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he said, he stops studying us. A small smile crossed his face. Tomorrow he starts studying me. That is when the real interrogation begins. The next morning, Daniel Mercer walked into the interrogation room, carrying 2 paper coffee cups and a small white bakery box. The security officers exchanged puzzled looks through the observation glass. Commander Olivia Grant touched her headset. Did anyone authorize outside food? A guard checked the log. It passed inspection. Daniel set 1 cup on the table across from the prisoner, placed the unopened box beside it, and sat down without saying a word. The alien stared at the unfamiliar items. Is this another human technique? Daniel shrugged. Breakfast. I do not consume human food. I figured. Daniel picked up his own cup, took a slow sip, and smiled. That means more for me. Another long silence settled between them. The prisoner watched Daniel eat half of a cinnamon roll without ever taking his eyes off him. It was not suspicion anymore. It was concentration. Daniel noticed the difference immediately. Yesterday, the prisoner had been waiting to defend himself. Today, he was trying to understand the man sitting across the table. That shift mattered. Daniel finally spoke. You have been here almost a month. 24 days. See? Better memory than mine. The alien tilted his head. You intentionally speak imprecisely. Daniel laughed softly. Sometimes. Why? Because exact numbers are not always important. That statement is objectively false. Daniel nodded as though they were discussing the weather. Maybe. The prisoner frowned. You do not appear concerned by contradictions. Not usually. Contradictions prevent accurate conclusions. Daniel leaned back comfortably. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they reveal who is trying too hard to reach one. Behind the glass, Dr. Lena Brooks whispered. He keeps answering without actually answering. Grant replied quietly. And somehow that is making our prisoner more uncomfortable. Inside the room, the alien folded his hands on the table. Your species accepts uncertainty too easily. Daniel smiled. No. We live with it because we have to. He looked toward the ceiling for a moment, as if remembering something. When I was 8 years old, my older sister convinced me there was a monster living in our attic. I believed her for 2 weeks. The prisoner blinked. Why would your sibling intentionally provide false information? Because she thought it was funny. Did she dislike you? Daniel laughed out loud. No. She loved me. She was just my sister. The alien stared without speaking. Daniel could almost see the invisible calculations racing behind those silver eyes. Love, trust, false information, humor. The concepts refused to fit together. They collided instead. Daniel continued in the same relaxed tone. My father let me believe it for another day before showing me it was just an old furnace making strange noises. Then we all laughed about it at dinner. Your family deceived you collectively? For less than 48 hours. And this strengthened your social bonds. Daniel nodded. Believe it or not, yes. The prisoner looked genuinely unsettled for the first time. Every relationship in his experience depended on complete informational reliability. Daniel had just described affection existing alongside deception without either destroying the other. It was not merely unfamiliar. It was incompatible with everything the prisoner believed intelligent societies should be. Daniel noticed the silence growing heavier. Good, he thought. He was no longer questioning facts. He was questioning assumptions. Daniel stood, picked up the untouched second cup of coffee, and carried it toward the door. You forgot your beverage, the prisoner said automatically. Daniel smiled over his shoulder. I brought 2 cups because I knew you would not drink one. Then why bring it? Daniel rested his hand on the door handle. Because I wanted to see whether you would ask that question. The alien opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since his capture, he had no framework that explained what had just happened, and Daniel walked out knowing confusion had finally taken root. On the 25th day, Daniel Mercer entered the room carrying nothing at all. No coffee. No notebook. No bakery box. The prisoner noticed immediately. You changed your routine, he said before Daniel even reached the chair. Daniel smiled to himself. There it was. Yesterday the alien had been reacting. Today he was anticipating. Good morning, Daniel said as he sat down. I expected coffee. Did you? You brought it yesterday. Yesterday is over. The prisoner remained silent for several seconds. Humans abandon established patterns without reason. Sometimes there is a reason. Then what is today's reason? Daniel folded his hands. You tell me. The alien looked at him carefully, searching for clues that simply were not there. Behind the observation glass, Commander Olivia Grant leaned closer to the monitor. He is asking nearly every question now, she whispered. Dr. Lena Brooks nodded. He cannot stop himself. Daniel spoke again in a calm voice. Have you ever played cards? No. Chess? No. Any competitive game? Games are educational simulations where all participants understand the rules beforehand. Daniel smiled. That explains a lot. The prisoner frowned. Your games do not function that way. Some do. Some do not. Daniel rested his elbows lightly on the table. Where I come from, there is a game called poker. The interesting part is that sometimes the strongest hand loses, and sometimes the weakest hand wins. That is statistically impossible. Only if everyone tells the truth. Another tiny pause. Daniel continued before the alien could recover. Players bluff. They pretend confidence when they are weak. Sometimes they pretend weakness when they are strong. The cards matter. The people matter more. The prisoner's silver eyes narrowed. That sounds irrational. Completely. Daniel nodded. Which is why people love it. The alien stared at the tabletop. Your civilization voluntarily created entertainment based on false information. Not exactly. Daniel smiled. It is based on incomplete information. Those are equivalent concepts. Not to humans. The answer landed harder than Daniel expected. The prisoner's breathing changed ever so slightly. He was trying to force 2 incompatible ideas into a single logical framework. Daniel let the silence work for him. Finally, the prisoner looked up. How do you determine when another human is deceiving you? Daniel shrugged. Sometimes we do not. Then your decisions must frequently be incorrect. Absolutely. That is an extraordinary weakness. Daniel laughed softly. It can be. He leaned forward just enough to lower his voice. It can also be an extraordinary advantage. The prisoner looked genuinely puzzled. Explain. Daniel shook his head. No. Why? Because you are asking the wrong question. Outside the room, one of the younger analysts whispered. He has not mentioned the investigation once. Grant answered without taking her eyes off the screen. He does not need to anymore. Daniel stood and slowly walked toward the observation window instead of the exit. He looked through the glass as though studying his own reflection. You know, he said casually, I almost did not accept this assignment. The prisoner looked up immediately. Why? Daniel kept his back turned. I read your file. And I thought you would be harder to surprise. The room became perfectly still. Daniel did not turn around. He simply continued speaking in the same relaxed tone. Yesterday, when I mentioned my sister, your pupils widened. This morning, they did it again when I said poker. That tells me your training covered human language, but not human culture. The prisoner's expression remained calm, but one finger moved almost imperceptibly against the tabletop. Daniel saw it without looking directly at him. Interesting, Daniel murmured. So I guessed correctly. The alien's voice became unusually quiet. You did not know that. Daniel finally looked back with an easy smile that revealed nothing. No, he admitted. I did not. The prisoner froze. In that single moment, he realized something profoundly unsettling. The human had spoken a sentence with no evidence, no certainty, and no proof. Yet by reacting to it, he had supplied the missing answer himself. Daniel Mercer did not return the next morning, or the morning after that. The interrogation room remained empty except for the silent prisoner and the faint hum of the environmental systems. Commander Olivia Grant watched the live feed with growing curiosity. He requested 48 hours away from the facility, she said. One of the analysts frowned. Why would he stop now? He finally has momentum. Dr. Lena Brooks answered before Grant could. Because now the prisoner is doing the work for him. She pointed toward the monitor. Watch. Every few minutes the alien glanced toward the door. Sometimes he looked at the empty chair. Other times he studied the table where Daniel usually sat. The pattern repeated hour after hour. Daniel had become the variable the prisoner could no longer calculate. Late on the second afternoon, Daniel finally returned. He carried a folded newspaper under one arm and wore the same relaxed smile he always seemed to have. He entered the room, nodded politely, and sat down without speaking. The prisoner broke the silence almost immediately. You did not come. Daniel unfolded the newspaper. That is true. Why? I had other things to do. More important than this. Daniel looked over the top of the paper. Everything is important to somebody. The prisoner frowned. You intentionally left me waiting. Daniel lowered the paper. Did I? Yes. Interesting. He folded the newspaper neatly and placed it beside his chair. I never promised I would return yesterday. The alien hesitated. Daniel continued in the same calm voice. You expected me anyway. Behind the observation glass, Grant whispered. He is making him explain his own assumptions. Brooks nodded. Exactly. Daniel rested both hands on the table. Tell me something. During the last 2 days, how many different reasons did you imagine for my absence? The prisoner answered carefully. Several. More than 5. Yes. More than 10. Another pause. Yes. Daniel smiled gently. Humans call that filling in the blanks. You deliberately created missing information. I simply went home. Daniel shrugged. You created everything else. The prisoner lowered his eyes for a moment. It was the longest break in eye contact since Daniel had arrived days earlier. Your absence became distracting. Daniel nodded as though the admission was perfectly ordinary. Uncertainty usually is. The alien looked back up. Humans tolerate uncertainty because you experience it continuously. That is part of it. You also create uncertainty intentionally. Daniel smiled. Sometimes, even among friends, especially among friends. The prisoner seemed genuinely unsettled again. Your social structure appears inefficient. Daniel laughed quietly. You keep measuring humans by efficiency. Should I not? Daniel leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you something instead. If every person always told the complete truth, would anyone ever learn to recognize deception if it appeared? The prisoner answered immediately. There would be no need. Exactly. Daniel let the silence settle before speaking again. Humans never had that luxury. The words lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. Outside, the analysts remained perfectly still. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Daniel looked down at the folded newspaper. Do you know what I did yesterday? No. I took my granddaughter to a baseball game. The prisoner blinked. Is that true? Daniel looked into his silver eyes with the same easy expression he had worn since the first day. Does it matter? The alien opened his mouth, then stopped. For several long seconds, he searched Daniel's face for certainty, for evidence, for anything solid enough to classify as truth. There was nothing. Only calm. Only possibility. Daniel quietly stood and picked up the newspaper. That, he said as he walked toward the door, is the first question you have asked that has no correct answer until you decide whether to believe me. Welcome to the world humans grow up in every single day. The following morning, Daniel Mercer walked into the interrogation room carrying a thin manila folder. He placed it on the table without opening it. The prisoner looked at the folder first, then at Daniel. "You finally brought evidence," he said. Daniel pulled out his chair and sat down. "Maybe." The alien stared at the sealed folder. "What is inside?" "Paper." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I am giving you." Several long seconds passed. The prisoner never looked away from the folder. Daniel noticed every tiny movement, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the almost invisible tightening of one hand against the edge of the table. 25 days earlier, this operative had ignored every prop investigators placed in front of him. Now a simple folder had become impossible for him to dismiss. Behind the observation glass, Commander Olivia Grant quietly asked, "Is there actually anything important in there?" Daniel's microphone carried his calm reply before anyone inside the room could hear it. "Nothing classified." Dr. Lena Brooks blinked. "Then why bring it?" Grant slowly smiled. "Because he wants the prisoner to decide what is inside before he ever opens it." Daniel rested both hands on the table. "You have been thinking a lot lately." The prisoner answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Sleeping well?" "Less than before." "That happens." Daniel nodded sympathetically. "The human mind does strange things when it cannot complete a pattern." The alien tilted his head. "You assume my thoughts resemble yours." "No." Daniel smiled. "I assume intelligence dislikes unfinished stories." That answer lingered in the room. Finally, the prisoner looked directly at Daniel instead of the folder. "You are changing me." Daniel shook his head gently. "No. I am showing you something your education never prepared you to see." The prisoner's voice grew quieter. "You have repeatedly spoken statements that were partially true, partially false, or impossible to verify. That is accurate. How do humans function if reality is constantly uncertain?" Daniel laughed softly. "Reality is not uncertain. Information is." The alien remained silent. Daniel continued. "You have spent your entire life believing every question has one correct answer waiting to be discovered. Humans learn something different. Sometimes the important question is not whether a statement is true. Sometimes the important question is why someone chose to say it." The prisoner's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Daniel saw it immediately. He had landed exactly where he wanted. "Yesterday you asked whether I really took my granddaughter to a baseball game," Daniel said. "You never asked why I told you that story." The alien stared at him without speaking. "Do you know why?" Daniel asked. "No. Because I wanted to know whether you would investigate the facts or the motive." Daniel leaned back comfortably. "You chose the facts." Behind the glass, Brooks whispered, "He is dismantling the prisoner's entire decision-making model." Grant nodded slowly. "And he is doing it without accusing him of anything." Inside the room, Daniel slid the unopened folder 6 inches across the table. "Go ahead." The prisoner looked down. "Open it. If you want." "Am I permitted?" "Of course." The alien carefully opened the folder. Inside was nothing except a blank sheet of white paper. He looked up in complete confusion. Daniel smiled. "What did you expect to find?" The prisoner hesitated. "Evidence." "Against you?" "Yes." Daniel nodded once. "Interesting." The alien frowned. "There was never any evidence." "Not in the folder." Daniel stood and picked up his jacket. "But now I know exactly what kind of evidence worries you the most." The prisoner suddenly understood what had happened. He had spent the last several minutes revealing his own fears, while Daniel had revealed absolutely nothing. As the door opened, Daniel paused one final time. "People think deception is about hiding the truth," he said quietly. "Most of the time it is about letting someone else build a story with their own imagination. Human beings have been doing that for thousands of years. You have only been experiencing it for 1 week." When Daniel Mercer entered the room the next morning, he did not sit down. He remained standing beside the table with his hands in his pockets, studying the prisoner with the same calm expression that had become strangely familiar. The alien looked more tired than before. Not physically, mentally. His silver eyes no longer carried the quiet certainty they had worn during the first 23 days. They searched Daniel's face the way someone searched a map that kept changing every time they looked away. "You have already won," the prisoner said quietly. Daniel tilted his head. "Won what?" "This." Daniel smiled. "That depends on how you define winning." The prisoner looked down for a moment before speaking again. I have spent my entire life believing intelligence meant identifying objective truth. Every conversation with you has forced me to question whether truth is even the first thing humans search for. Daniel slowly pulled out the chair and finally sat down. Now you are asking better questions. The alien took a slow breath. Answer one honestly. I usually do. No. The prisoner shook his head. You answer carefully. That is different. Daniel could not help smiling. Fair point. The room became quiet again. Commander Olivia Grant watched every second through the observation glass. Nobody in the observation room spoke anymore. Weeks earlier they had been analyzing the prisoner. Now they were studying Daniel. The human rested his elbows lightly on the table. Go ahead. The prisoner looked directly into his eyes. When did you begin interrogating me? Daniel answered without hesitation. The moment you noticed I was different. The alien remained perfectly still. Not when you entered the room? No. Not when you spoke? No. Daniel shook his head gently. The interrogation started when you became curious. The words seemed to settle over the room like dust. Daniel continued in the same steady voice. Curiosity changes attention. Attention changes expectations. Expectations change behavior. After that, people usually do the rest themselves. The prisoner closed his eyes briefly. There was never a strategy to force information from me. Of course there was. Daniel smiled. It just was not the strategy everyone expected. The alien looked back up. You never tried to defeat me. No. You dismantled the way I evaluated reality. Daniel gave a small nod. That was always easier. Behind the glass, Dr. Lena Brooks quietly whispered. He finally understands. Commander Grant answered just as softly. Not everything. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table but did not slide it forward. Yesterday you assumed the blank page meant nothing. The prisoner looked at it carefully. Did I misunderstand? Yes. Daniel unfolded the paper. On it were only 3 handwritten words. What comes next? The alien frowned. That is all. That is all. Daniel leaned back comfortably. Yesterday you thought about evidence. Today you are wondering what I will do after this conversation. Tomorrow you will wonder what I wanted you to think today. The prisoner's expression slowly changed. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice, but Daniel recognized it immediately. It was acceptance, not surrender. Understanding. This never ends, the alien said quietly. Daniel nodded. Now you understand human conversations. A faint, almost reluctant smile appeared on the prisoner's face. Your species lives inside layers of possibility. Most days, Daniel replied. It is exhausting. Daniel laughed softly. You get used to it. The alien looked at the handwritten note one last time before meeting Daniel's eyes again. There is something I have been trying to understand since you first walked through that door. What is that? How can a civilization survive if nobody can ever be completely certain? Daniel stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit. Just before the door opened, he stopped without turning around. Because, he said calmly, we learned a long time ago that trust is not built by finding people who never deceive you. It is built by learning who still stands beside you after the truth finally comes out. For the first time since his capture, the prisoner said nothing at all, because he had finally reached a conclusion no amount of perfect logic could have prepared him to understand. Daniel Mercer returned one final time with no folder, no coffee, and no prepared remarks. He walked into the room as though he were stopping by to visit an old co-worker before retirement. The prisoner looked up, and for the first time since arriving at Coalition Security Complex 9, there was no calculation behind his eyes. Only curiosity. Daniel sat down and folded his hands. Good morning. I believe this is goodbye, the prisoner replied. Daniel smiled. Probably. A quiet settled between them that no longer felt uncomfortable. Commander Olivia Grant watched from behind the observation glass with the rest of the staff. Nobody reached for a keyboard. Nobody whispered theories anymore. They simply watched. The prisoner spoke first. I have one final question. I figured you would. You never asked me for classified information. Daniel nodded. No. You never demanded names. No. You never threatened me. No. The alien lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back up. Then why am I considering telling you things that I refuse to tell everyone else? Daniel answered without hesitation. Because I stopped trying to take something from you. The prisoner remained silent. Daniel continued in the same calm voice. Most interrogations become contests. One side wants information. The other side wants control. People become so focused on winning that they stop listening. The alien slowly nodded. You listened. I listened to how you think. Daniel smiled gently. That matters more than what you know. The prisoner leaned back and looked toward the ceiling. When I arrived here, I believed humans were intellectually undisciplined. Your conversations wandered. Your stories mixed fact with humor. Your emotions complicated every decision. I thought it was a flaw. Daniel chuckled softly. A lot of humans think so too. The alien looked back at him. Now I believe something different. Daniel waited. Your species survived because you learned to function inside uncertainty instead of trying to eliminate it. Daniel gave a small nod. That is closer. The prisoner took a slow breath. You do not fear that people can deceive you. We do, Daniel admitted. But we also know something else. What? Daniel looked toward the observation window where dozens of coalition officers stood in complete silence. Every lie tells you something about the person telling it. Every truth tells you something too. Wisdom comes from learning the difference. The room was quiet enough to hear the ventilation system humming above them. Finally, the prisoner reached across the table and gently pushed an untouched data card toward Daniel. There are no fleet positions on it, he said. No weapons. No military codes. Daniel did not pick it up. What is it? Our academy's complete doctrine for training intelligence officers. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why would you give me that? The prisoner answered with complete sincerity. Because it is already obsolete. Daniel looked at the card for several long seconds before placing it back in front of the alien. Keep it. The prisoner looked surprised. You do not want it. Daniel stood and slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. No. Why? Daniel smiled with the quiet confidence that had puzzled an entire coalition for days. Because if your people are capable of learning what you learned in this room, then one day we will not need rooms like this anymore. The prisoner slowly closed his hand around the data card. Behind the observation glass, Commander Olivia Grant finally understood why Earth had sent Daniel Mercer instead of a soldier or a scientist. Humanity's greatest advantage had never been deception itself. It was the willingness to question its own certainty, to admit it could be wrong, and then keep listening anyway. As Daniel walked out of the facility and into the cool morning air, he pulled out his phone and smiled at a picture his daughter had sent of his granddaughter holding a baseball glove almost bigger than she was. Life moved on the way it always did. The galaxy would remember the reports, the lectures, and the policy changes that followed this case. Daniel would remember a little girl asking if he could make it to her next game. Years later, the official coalition manual added a single sentence to every intelligence training program. It was not classified. It was not complicated. It simply read, never assume understanding another mind begins with proving it wrong. Sometimes it begins by accepting that it learned to survive a world completely different from your own.